Hello, true health seeker. Have you ever thought about becoming a health coach? Do you love learning about nutrition and how we can shift our lifestyle and our diet so that we can gain optimal health and happiness and longevity? Do you love helping your friends and family to solve their health problems and to figure out what they can do to eat healthier? You might be the perfect candidate to become a health coach. So check out IIN, check out the Institute for Integrative Nutrition, mention my name, get the best deal, give them a call and they'll give you lots of free information and help you to see if this is the right move for you. Classes are starting soon, so you're going to want to call them now and check it out. And if you know anyone in your life who would be an amazing coach, please tell them about it. Being a health coach is so rewarding and you get to help so many people. And enjoy this amazing interview. Welcome to the Learn True Health podcast. I'm your host, Ashley James. This is episode 324. I am so excited to have back on the show Dr. Alan Christianson, who's an amazing naturopathic endocrinologist. We had him on the show episode 307. It's a wonderful episode. I highly recommend going back and listening to it if you haven't already. And at the end of the episode, we mentioned that we might do this again and dive deeper into understanding the thyroid and iodine, which is such a cool topic. And then also diving deeper into adrenal health. Thank you so much for coming back on the show. I'm really excited to dive into these topics today.
Ashley, I'm super jazzed to be here with you. It was a blast talking to you before and super bright and lots of good things came out from that. So yeah, I'm totally stoked.
Nice. Awesome. Well, and I want to mention that your book is about to come out. We're so excited. I cannot wait to get my copy of the Metabolism Reset Diet. Listeners can go to the link is going to be in the show notes of the podcast today at learntruehealth.com, and that link will take you to Amazon where you can pre-purchase it. It's coming out later this month. When is it coming out? What's the exact date?
January 29th.
Oh, it's just around the corner. Excellent. And your book isn't, I mean, when we hear Metabolism Reset Diet, I think some people have been jaded by the plethora of diet books out there. Your book stands alone. It is not like one of those hokey, lose weight in 7 days when you think diet and all that stuff. I can't believe 1 minute abs, 30-second abs, 1 nanosecond abs. I mean, it's just ridiculous how many diet books are out there. But yours is science-based, and you did a wonderful clinical study that helps us to navigate and understand the science behind the foods that will help us to bring our body back into balance, bring our digestion back into our balance, our hormones, and also decrease that waist to height ratio that we talked about in the last episode. So I'm really excited about your book that's coming out. Is there anything that you'd like to say about your book, about the launch, about your excitement around it before we move on to talking about thyroid and iodine?
Just super brief. It's a new story about how the liver plays a role in keeping metabolism healthy. And it's not about amping metabolism like a stimulant could do temporarily. It's about making it to where someone naturally gravitates towards a healthy balance between energy and, burning fuel and storing fuel, getting that stuff right again, getting the body to where it's fixed and you don't have to live life on a diet. So it's a means to an end.
Yes. I'm sure that was the original title of the book, right? The last diet you'll ever need.
That could have been a better one. I should have reached out to you last year.
Right. Well, come to me anytime you're going to bring a book out. I'll help you brainstorm the titles.
I'll make a note on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Well, yeah, let's dive into this understanding of how to support our thyroid and especially iodine. I mean, that is such an elusive topic because anytime you Google it, some people say, you don't want to take iodine, and some people say we need to take mega doses of iodine. So which is it? What do we need?
There's a truth that's somewhere in the middle, but iodine's weird in so many ways, and one of which is that there's a narrow therapeutic range. We really need some, but we run the risk of getting too little, and we run the risk of getting too much. And too little and too much are closer together than ideally it would be. Yeah.
That's
It's
interesting. How do we know if we're too little, and how do we know if we're too much?
well, it's one of the first chemical elements ever isolated, and the name itself comes from the violet color that the element has. And so, it's been investigated in various ways for well over a century. It's by far the most studied nutrient. And most people are doing okay getting enough. We'll go way into more detail on all this. The short answer is that the people that are on thyroid treatment, by and large, they run a risk of getting too much. Thyroid medications contain active thyroid hormones, and they're built from iodine. And so
Mm.
there's iodine already in that. And getting too much can seem a lot like too little in terms of how it affects the body.
So you could have the same symptoms and you don't know whether you're overdosing or underdosing?
Exactly. And here's why there's so many ways in which it's different from many other nutrients. So one of them is that the amount that you need is about 100-fold above what you find in your bloodstream. So the thyroid concentrates iodine. And that's not the story for B12 or magnesium or vitamin C or anything else. The blood levels we have that wash through our organs, assuming we're not deficient, that's appropriate for what our organs and our tissues need. But iodine is not, and so we concentrate it. And the concentrator is important because it's a nutrient that we wouldn't get on a consistent basis. But the pitfall about that concentrator is that if we get a lot of it, we shut down the factory. Almost like if you've got too much current that goes through one of the wires in your home, you got a fuse breaker, blow a fuse so you don't burn down the house. And it's the exact same thing with iodine. So too much just shuts off all the mechanisms that do it's kind of the same thing that happens when there's too little.
So the thyroid, if you take too much iodine, your thyroid will shut down?
Correct. So this is called the Wolff-Chaikoff effect, and it's it's extremely consistent. So in fact, there's one of the worst things in all of thyroid medicine is a thing called Thyroid Storm, and that's a complication of Graves' hyperthyroidism, so overactive thyroid. And it's, overactive thyroid on steroids. It's so much coming out that people can die of just heart failure in a matter of moments. So it's an emergency situation. And the way that you treat Graves' disease in terms of pills or treatments to slow the thyroid, they all take 4 to 6 weeks. So in Thyroid Storm, minutes count. And the one surefire way to shut down a crazy overactive thyroid is with megadose iodine. There's nothing more consistent. So that's just a strong example of that. The other example is, after we had the horrible disasters in Fukushima, there was a lot of talk about taking prophylactic iodine to protect against future thyroid cancer. And the mechanism for there is the same thing. So if you get a high dose of iodine, specifically your thyroid stops, one thing that happens, it stops absorbing iodine. So if you did know that you were going to be exposed to radioactive iodine ahead of time, and you took a high dose of iodine preemptively, you would shut off your iodine absorption within your thyroid for about 3 weeks, and therefore the junk wouldn't get trapped in. So yeah, those are two examples of how it works to shut it off and how we know that it works well.
It shuts down for 3 weeks?
At least, and here's the other wrinkle: if someone's got some susceptibility towards thyroid disease, if they've got latent autoimmunity, well, the shutting down and the coming back online doesn't always work right. So it's the best known trigger of Hashimoto's. So Hashimoto's was discovered by a Japanese physician because the Japanese have the highest rates of autoimmune thyroid disease and thyroid cancer. They've also got the world's highest iodine intake. And in the US, we had a lot of goiter, especially around the Great Lakes and areas with a lot of fresh water and little seawater access because there was just less iodine in the soil. But we really didn't have autoimmune thyroid disease. And then around 1907, 1912, somewhere in that range, we've got the Morton salt, the little gal with the umbrella, and we started fortifying 1 part to 10,000 potassium iodide to table salt. And lo and behold, within a decade, the rate of goiter amongst school children in Michigan went from 35% to about 2%. It was a huge success. But in the following decade, we unmasked autoimmune thyroid disease. We didn't really have it here, and then we got caught up with the rest of the world on it.
Wow, that is a really fine line to walk.
It's a fine line, and it seems that the safest threshold is about 100 to 300 micrograms per day, but it's even more bizarre than that. They've done studies, for example, places like Denmark, they fortified really judiciously, and they went from an average of 50 to 70 micrograms up to about 150 micrograms. It was perfect. But we've also seen that just when you shift a population's iodine intake, not even too much, but just moving what they were used to, that itself also unmasks a lot of autoimmune thyroid disease.
The lesson here so far is don't go willy-nilly to the health food store and start taking drops of iodine, right?
And it could seem this is a case to where what seems really logical just is like opposite day in terms of what the body does. Someone could legitimately have symptoms that are caused by hypothyroidism, or they could think might be caused by hypothyroidism. Say they're struggling with weight, or they're tired all the time, or hair is thinning, real issues. And someone could think, hey, this could relate to my thyroid. My thyroid needs iodine. So it could seem logical that iodine could help. But yeah, you're right. That could be the exact opposite of what they need. It could make things worse.
Man, and I've seen so much information about how beneficial iodine is, and children who are deficient in it can have 15 points knocked off of their IQ. I mean, it's affecting so many systems of the body, not just thyroid health.
Well, so thyroid health does affect a lot of systems of the body, especially brain development among kids. You're
There you
right.
go.
And to date, it's been estimated that there's about 1 billion people on planet Earth who didn't really get the brain function they deserved because they were lacking iodine as they grew up. Have you ever heard the term cretin before?
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a really, really dated term of like a dummy or an idiot, but back in the day, that was a medical diagnosis. And there was some pockets of people who lived in the Alps that were so far removed from other cultures and also so far removed from access to seawater products or products from the ocean that they had endemic cretinism. And it was thought for a while they were actually like a different subspecies because they were shorter, they had more furrowed brows. They would never develop normal adult intelligence. They often had these severe bone disorders. But yeah, with the lack of iodine, then thyroid function is compromised and everything in the body does not develop in the ways that it should. It's a huge thing in parts of the globe still.
I think you just described one of my ex-boyfriends. I should call him up and tell him he's iodine deficient.
And then hang up.
And then, yeah. You cretin. Oh my gosh. So, should we just get it from our food? I mean, this is interesting that people who eat a culture that eats a lot of seafood can get so much exposure to iodine naturally that, like you said, it's uncovering some autoimmune thyroid issues. And then cultures that don't have access to iodine because it's not in the soil, they're landlocked, they're not
Mhm.
eating seafood, they can experience cretinism and other negative effects. So where's the balance, and how in modern day do we figure out whether we're getting too much or too little? Is it through blood testing? How would you help us if we were your patient?
Well, so here's another bizarre wrinkle about iodine. There's a lot of ways. The short answer is most people are doing well. We'll talk about a few that might be at risk and who might get too much. But in terms of knowing how much you have, this is another place where iodine just doesn't follow the pattern of other nutrients. So there's a lot of tests. There are spot urine tests, which means that a random sample of urine is analyzed. There's 24-hour urine tests. You pee in a jug for a day and take a little bit out of that, and it's meant to average out things that go up and down throughout the day. There's a recent thing called iodine challenge test, where you take a big dose and then see how much you excrete in the time afterward. There are some blood tests. You mentioned blood tests. And the pitfall is that there's a lot of those tests are decent to gauge how much iodine a population has. So if you were to go to Central Africa and screen 1,000 people with spot urinary iodine tests, you could have a good hunch on where the locus of iodine intake was in that population. Overall, do they need a little more, a little less? Generally more in that area. But because there's so much variation in any one person's random urine sample, you can't take, participant number 984 and pull their sample and sit them down and say, hey, this is a problem for you. You just can't do that. If you wanted to be accurate, you'd have to test one person about 350 times to be within 90% of what their needs are. So, yeah. And it's some of the best tests would only require about 200 tests for one person to be within 90% of accuracy. So there's no really good tests, but thankfully there's also no known human diversity in terms of iodine absorption or excretion. By and large, if we've got it in our diets, we will be absorbing it, and we get rid of it in pretty known reproducible ways. So if someone can know their overall intake, they can be aware of what their status would be.
I once I worked with a naturopath who swore by the skin test. At the beginning of the appointment, she'd put iodine on your arm, and if it was gone by the end of the appointment, you had an iodine deficiency because your body sucked it all up.
Oh, Ashley, I'm so glad you mentioned that. We're going to have fun with that one. Okay, so there was a really well-designed test that was done on the accuracy of the iodine skin test. And they chose 3 groups of people, and they put iodine on the skin, and they watched the rate of absorption. And they also measured how much got in and how much didn't get in. And one thing is that some iodine does absorb. So yeah, you can paint it on your skin, and some will end up in your body. About 80% just evaporates into the air, but there's a remaining 20% that you might absorb a few percent or a high percent. And so people have speculated if how much you absorbed was, just random, or if there was some mechanism behind that. And so in the study, the 3 groups of people, one group was known to have thyroid disease, hypothyroidism, in areas from more so iodine deficiency, so likely iodine deficient. The other group did not. And the third group, the third group was dead. It was cadaver skin.
Oh my gosh.
So they painted a lot of people and a lot of cadavers with iodine, and they watched absorption and whatnot. And it turned out that there was no relationship whatsoever between how it absorbed, whether someone needed it, didn't need it, was alive, wasn't alive. It was all just completely random. So the other fun wrinkle is this test was done in 1932.
Oh my gosh.
I might be off by a year, but it was in the early 30s. So this was well studied a long time ago, and it was not a new theory, but yeah, it just didn't pan out.
Wow. So when should someone take an iodine supplement?
Well, there's really no cause for supplementation, in all honesty, apart from the rare circumstances of radioiodine exposure. And even then, the window of time is so exacting, and the age to whom it helps is really narrow. If someone is between, to my memory, age like 3 and 14, and they know upwards of 4 days before they'll have exposure radioactive iodine, there's exact dosages that are all written out. But even adults, it's not helpful for radioactive exposure. And there are times to where it's used with medical imaging, like the test to evaluate thyroid function, you'll ingest iodine. But apart from that, not so much as a supplement. There are foods that contain it, and there's iodized salt and non-iodized salt. There's one population can be at risk for getting low if their diet is more stringent, and that's pregnant women. And one of the last NHANES study looked at this in detail and saw that about 16% were at risk for running low. They were just below ideal. And with a healthy intake of seafood, and that's a time to where, certainly the low mercury is a double concern, but seafood's also helpful for other ways. So with some appropriate intake of seafood, a good variety of produce in the diet, it's easy not to become deficient. The other group that can be at risk are raw food vegans that don't use any iodine fortified salt. I actually really like sea salt for general use because you get some magnesium out of the deal, but most sea salts are not iodine fortified. So if someone were, consuming no animal products and especially just raw foods, they can get low. And then we talk about goitrogens. So we can go deeper in those too, but so some plants have a weak effect on lowering iodine absorption. And so I once saw a young man who his diet was comprised of just raw vegetables and probably about 80, 90% raw broccoli, like 2 to 4 pounds per day
Mm-hmm.
that he would blend up. And he did that for about 2 months. And his father brought him in to see me and said, "Hey, look, we heard something is wrong with his thyroid, and we think that it may be related to his diet. His regular doctor just wants to put him on medication, but he's been on an extreme diet. I thought you might want to check this out and talk to him." And yeah, sure enough. So the prescription was stop it. He keep on eating good food. That's great, but eat other food too and have a more variety of categories. And then he was fine.
Wow. That's so, yeah, how would someone be a raw vegan and get enough iodine? Would they need to find some sources of kelp?
If they did iodized salt, that would be easy. Kelp
Mm.
is a great point to mention. It's got ridiculously high amounts of iodine. It's got a lot. And sea vegetables in general are rich in iodine. Most forms of sea vegetables have enough to be useful, but not enough to throw you way out of the ballpark. Kelp is a lot. So tiny amounts could be useful, but food-like amounts, people can easily get too much. Nori, which is the popular sheets that people snack on, the nori snacks or whatnot, those are pretty reasonable amounts of iodine. Like a big sheet is about 50 to 70 micrograms. Dulse is on the high moderate side. But yeah, but the big thing that makes me talk about this a lot is that people with thyroid disease, that sweet spot of 100 to 300 micrograms, most common thyroid medications put them themselves contain anywhere from 130 to 200 micrograms. And there are times based upon thyroid treatments where you want someone to get below 100 micrograms in their diet. You've got to work hard to do that. A diet that's good, bad, or sideways probably has 150 micrograms of iodine per day. So people on thyroid treatment, they're usually at the upper limit of what's safe for them just from any diet, adding that diet to their medication.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, so those who are on thyroid medications might need to not eat kelp.
Correct. And not only that, but most in home use, most cases we have iodized salt. Here's some fun random iodine trivia. So most of our salt now comes from food that we get from restaurants or food that's pre-cooked to some degree or pre-packaged in supermarkets. Most people don't use that much salt in home cooking anymore. It's mostly coming from some level of processed foods for the average
Mm-hmm.
person. And in almost all circumstances, those processed foods are made with non-iodized salt because it was thought in the past that that was a smaller part of the diet. For whatever bizarre reason, Burger King is a known exception to that. They use iodized salt, but other restaurants and supermarkets do not. So the thought is that with that fortification, even just adding iodized salt, people can get reasonable amounts themselves. But those with thyroid treatment may even need to be eliminating iodized salt. And then you think about pills. So pretty much all multivitamins will have between 100 and 200 micrograms. So we've had scores of people with thyroid disease that are struggling, they're symptomatic, they can't get their levels right. And just like our step one, almost like if you call tech support and they ask if your computer's plugged in, so for us, that's getting iodine dialed in, making sure you're not getting too much along with your medication. And that one little thing alone, it can be as big of a deal as getting your computer plugged in to having your computer work right.
So can you walk us through, so someone who's on thyroid medication, like can either on I know there's so many different thyroid conditions, but with the most common ones, can you walk us through like what too much iodine does while someone's on medication? Is it that the biggest concern is that it's just going to shut the thyroid down completely?
This is something that one of my doctors found some papers on and educated me about recently is that Wolff-Chaikoff effect that I told you about. From what I had read in the past, I thought about it more like a fuse box to where it's fine and the current's going through, or the fuse blows and there's no current moving at all. But the newer perspective is that it's not a fuse box, it's more like a rheostat, like a dial. And so if someone's between their supplements, their diet, their thyroid meds, if they're cruising along at 400, 500 micrograms per day, it's just like driving your car with the parking brake on a couple clicks. So it's slowing down how your gland releases hormone, and also creating more overall resistance to thyroid hormone in your whole body.
Oh, that's interesting. I once had a doctor on that talked about the that all the receptors in the body for so all the trillions of cells in the body have receptors for thyroid hormone, and that our understanding of resistance towards thyroid in our cells was just as important to look at as the thyroid functioning itself.
Sure.
So does too much iodine create like a thyroid resistance in our cells?
It can be a factor for that. The most typical thing that does that is just too much thyroid hormone that someone's taking, but yeah, the iodine levels can be a factor behind that as well.
Wow, you threw me for a loop. I was coming into this conversation thinking you were going to tell us how great iodine is and how we all need to like start supplementing with it.
Well, it's not, none of this stuff is ever, and I don't know, in the body foods, I keep, when I start, I like to think about, good or bad, but it just never works out that way. It's like, no, we need some. And, there's this odd toxin most of us have in our homes called dihydrogen monoxide. And it turns out that you can drink, it's everywhere, and you can drink too much of it and die in a matter of minutes. And so the joke is that dihydrogen monoxide, I know what that is. That's it's water, and you can drink too much and get hyponatremia. So, all things, it's always about the dosage for good or bad. And iodine's the same way. And what happened, I've been practicing since 96 and following this world for a little longer, but I saw this whole thing emerge and unfold. And there was a patient of mine who was just like a model of health. He was 80, and, he was the type to where he was total engineer temperament, and I'm saying that not in a derogatory way, but he would always have his tests and just line everything up. What's this? What's there? How can I move this? How can I get this right? Okay, I'll do it, and he would do it, and it would work, But one year he came back, and not having he was seasonal. He would be in Michigan half the year and come down to Arizona when it was cold. And one year he was on thyroid treatment, and that's not a common thing to emerge in a man at his age. And it was a type that was more rare. He had a toxic nodular goiter, and that form, when someone gets that, it's usually because they've had a really high dose of iodine. And before, we would only see that from someone who was given amiodarone. That's a pretty harsh medication for regulating cardiac rhythm. Or in the past, it was more common that iodine was given as a contrast agent for CTs or MRIs.
Right.
And I knew this guy had some back issues. So as soon as I saw he had toxic nodular goiter, I'm like, oh, okay, so he must have had a MRI back home. They gave him iodine contrast, and that set this off. So I saw this and asked him about his back, and I thought I was going to be like the wonder kid for figuring out that the back was behind all of it. And he's like, no, the back's been fine. And I'm like, well, how did this happen? And so he explained how he was given an iodine challenge test.
Oh.
And yeah, so someone gave him a high dose of iodine. And to put numbers on this, I mentioned that 1 to 300 micrograms. So it's always good to be oriented. So if you got a paper clip and you could weigh that, that's about a gram. That's about 1 million micrograms. And if you could take a grain of salt and weigh that really well, that's about 1 milligram. That's about 1,000 micrograms. And so the amounts that we need in terms of thyroid and iodine, they're small quantities. So like 1 to 300 micrograms, like, a tenth of a grain of salt. And this challenge test was done with 25,000 micrograms, so 25 milligrams of iodine.
Oh my gosh.
So, yeah. And the rationale was you take a pill containing this much, sometimes even 50,000 micrograms, and then you would catch your urine for 24 hours. And the thought was, if you didn't pee out all of that iodine, then your body must have wanted it. And I thought, we wouldn't say that about mercury. You could there's a lot of nasty things that we can't get rid of right away, even though we want to, So, and then I started digging deep, and there was this whole alternate iodine view that was emerging back then. And nutrients work in the body in two different ways. So one of which is that they're a key that's necessary to open a lock or cause something to happen. But there's times too to where, I don't know, if you had like a bag of keys, or you took a whole bunch of keys in a sock, you could swing that sock and like break a window with it, So that's that's like a pharmacologic effect of a nutrient. So niacin, you could be deficient in that and have skin issues, pellagra, or you could take a huge amount of that and shut down a liver enzyme that makes cholesterol. So niacin in pharmacologic doses can lower cholesterol. Well, that doesn't mean that everyone that has high cholesterol is niacin deficient. They're different things. So people often conflate those. And there's been some studies showing that megadose iodine is definitely an effective treatment for fibrocystic breast disease. No doubt about that. You got to think through just side effects and thyroid complications, and is it worth it overall? But in the short term, it can work for many with fibrocystic breast disease. And so some people saw that, and they conflated the nutritional role of a nutrient with the pharmacologic role of a nutrient. And they speculated that, oh, wow, these doses that treated fibrocystic breast disease, they must have really been treating undiagnosed iodine deficiencies that are more common and need more iodine than we thought beforehand.
Mm. Wow. Yeah,
Yeah,
that makes me question so many things we hear. There's so many myths, health myths, especially in the holistic world.
yeah,
And and there's so much propaganda around allopathic medicine also. So like,
sure, for
we're here
sure.
to uncover the truth.
And
So
the tough thing is that things can seem intuitive like that, and they can seem to make a lot of sense, but then people start to speculate, and you end up building a big house, it's on a shaky foundation.
mhm.
And the whole house can seem internally consistent. It can seem to really make sense once you're inside of it, but it may just not at all line up with the world around it. And that's what happened with iodine.
I want to ask you, so what do we do? But I really feel like what we should do is make sure that we have a great naturopath like you on our team to help us navigate individually to make sure that we're in balance.
Certainly helpful. Yeah. And with iodine, simplest steps, if someone is on thyroid medication, uh, desiccated thyroid, synthetic thyroid, whatever type, the active hormone is always about iodine. Here's a fun thing for your listeners. So, thyroid medications like Synthroid, for example, that contains T4, also called thyroxine, and there's blood tests that measure T4. There's medications that have T4 and T3, like desiccated thyroid. There's blood tests of T3. So the 4 and the 3, those are iodine atoms. It's that simple. So making thyroid hormone, you're taking tyrosine, which is a common amino acid, easy to get, never really deficient, and you convert that to a protein called thyroglobulin, and then you use an enzyme called thyroid peroxidase to stick iodine onto it. So forming hormones is just taking a T and stacking on I's, and T0, T1, T2, T3, T4. So 2, 3, and 4 are the active hormones. And then once you release that hormone, using the hormone is just the opposite. You're taking that T4 and the T3 and you're popping off the iodines as you break it down. So 4 to 3 to 2 to 1 to 0. And the medications, because those numbers, the 4 and the 3, are iodine atoms, the medications all have a fair amount of iodine. Desiccated thyroid is at the first round of production is standardized to about 0.2% iodine per milligram of desiccated thyroid tablet. So a 1 grain tablet of desiccated thyroid is pretty close to 130 micrograms of iodine. T4, because of the chemistry of that, it's about 65% iodine per microgram of T4. So a 100 microgram Synthroid tablet is about 65 micrograms of iodine. And then T3 is just a little bit less. It's about 50 to 55%. So they've all got a lot. And with assuming someone's not raw food vegan, they have some other foods besides that in their diet, and they're on thyroid meds, their action step is quite simply to be aware of all of their high dose sources of iodine and stop them. There was a couple of studies out in the last few years. These were pretty cool. They took people who were newly diagnosed as hypothyroid, and in this one group, the average TSH score was 14. So they were pretty hypothyroid. They did one intervention for 8 weeks with these people. They had them work hard in their diets to get below 100 micrograms of iodine. They did no other treatment. They did no thyroid medication, nothing else. They just targeted less than 100 micrograms of iodine in the diet. At the end of the time frame, it was 78.6. I'm pretty sure it's 0.6. It might have been 0.3, but it was 78% of the participants were cured. They were like completely normal on their thyroid function. And that was all they did. So it's that big of a deal.
Wow. That is a big deal. I once knew an HBAth who didn't believe in giving patients Synthroid because he wanted to get them off of a T4 and get them on a T3. I think it was Armour thyroid.
Well, so Armour has T4 and T3 and T2. It's desiccated thyroid. There is just T3, which is either a product called Cytomel or generic leothyronine or compounded T3. So T3 alone does exist.
In your opinion, what is the best medication to get someone on when they have a thyroid issue to help them get to the point where they would no longer need it?
That's a cool question. And that's a very insightful question. People often think, I don't want to take medication because I might be stuck on it. And I think about it like a crutch. You got a bad foot. You don't want to live on a crutch, but if you don't use it, your foot may not get better. Mm-hmm. And so a medication could be just too much, in which case your body just gets lazy, never really takes over again. Or it could be not enough to be helpful, but there is a sweet spot. So part of it is the amount, is the dosing for the person. But then type of medication does also matter. And natural desiccated thyroid, often the term Armour is used the way the term Kleenex is used for facial tissues. and I make that distinction because I like Puffs Plus better than Kleenex. So I don't, but there's brands of desiccated thyroid I prefer over Armour, and I'll talk about why. So I like to talk about the category of natural desiccated thyroid and not just the one brand. Mm-hmm. But I like the category because you've got all the active hormones, the T4, the T3, and the T2. And when someone's lacking in thyroid, there's more cases than not to where even if they get enough T4, they may not have enough T3 or enough T2 that their body actually produces. So the full spectrum is cool. The other perk about desiccated thyroid is that you ever hear about taking locally grown pollen to help with allergies? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the idea is that you're ingesting something that is setting you off, and you do it in a regular, gentle way, and your immune system quits freaking out about it. So it's just like that. It's called an oral tolerance reaction. And if you ingest thyroid that contains thyroglobulin and thyroid peroxidase, your antibodies against thyroglobulin and thyroid peroxidase can often diminish. So that's another perk about taking thyroid, is that you're taking thyroid, and your body can get less reactive against thyroid because you're taking it as a pill. So having said that, a lot of conventional doctors do not like desiccated thyroid because of standardization problems. And they do exist, but they are more brand specific than they are universal. So there are other brands. I'm not paid by the company, but WP Thyroid and Nature Thyroid are two brands that are standardized to higher levels than synthetic thyroid is. So those are the ones that are my favorites.
Yeah, I've heard of Nature Thyroid, and I've heard of a few listeners who told me that they were put on it and that they were enjoying the results. I thought that was really interesting. So that's fascinating. This idea, it's almost like immunotherapy, training the immune system not to overreact. Why does the immune system start breaking down a thyroid?
Yeah, so this answer that I'll give, you could substitute connective tissue or nerve tissue, like rheumatoid arthritis or MS. This is a common thread by much of autoimmunity, but there's a perfect storm of genetic susceptibility and then some expression of attack against the tissue, often because something foreign ended up in this tissue, and then immune stress. So the genetic susceptibility, there's several different genes that are involved with thyroid disease. They're by and large, they're X-linked traits. So that means they're more common in women, but what it also means is that they're more common, they're almost universal in women that have a male relative with thyroid disease. So for example, we've got a son and a daughter, and XY, I've got XY, my wife is XX. So our daughter has two X chromosomes, and each of us gave her one. So she got my one X chromosome. My wife had two X chromosomes to give. So just to say, make a scenario, if my wife had thyroid disease, my daughter would have been more at risk for that. However, if I had thyroid disease, she would be just about destined to have it because I've only got, I would have had to have given her my one X chromosome. That would have been the one that had it. So that's one big factor. Then there's a variety of compounds that have been implicated that start the immune system to attack the thyroid. We've got about 340 environmental toxicants that have been documented. Mercury, perchlorate, fluoride are some big ones. Lead. Top of the list is iodine. That's the most studied and most well regarded. But many things can set that off. So something gets in the thyroid and irritates it, and then there's some activating event that really flips on the immune system. So your immune cells are hyped up, they're out to attack something, and here your thyroid is just looking suspicious. So they start to attack it and break it down. And that immune activation could be moving into pregnancy, it could be a bad infectious response, it could be an airborne allergic response. But yeah, those are the final instigating steps. And once they start to attack the gland. And based on the genetics, there's two ways that plays out. One of which is that this is all towards Hashimoto's, but Graves is also very similar. I'll table that for now. But within Hashimoto's, there's two ways it plays out. So one of which is that the attack causes the gland to get lumpy and big and swollen, and that's the goiterogenic thyroiditis. And the other one is the gland starts to get just chewed up like Swiss cheese, and that's the atrophic thyroiditis.
And in terms of Graves' disease, how does that differ?
Well, this is the bizarre thing. Graves' disease, which is the most common cause of hyperthyroidism, and then there's Hashimoto's disease, which is the most common cause by far of hypothyroidism. They are almost the exact same disease. They're just about identical. So with Hashimoto's, imagine you've got a factory that makes cars, making a silly analogy. And with Hashimoto's, there's some foreign agent who's firing off missiles, and they've bombed half the factory, so you can only make half as many cars. And if that's below production, then that's a problem. So that's hypothyroidism. But now imagine that you've got a button that controls how fast the assembly line moves, like a doorbell, like on the outside. And so imagine that someone snuck up and hit that button, and now the factories, the assembly line is going so fast, you've got all these cars piling up all over the place. So that's Graves. And to be more specific, the pituitary makes TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone, and that hits a receptor on the thyroid called the thyrotropin receptor, and it tells the thyroid to work and make hormone. It's kind of like hitting a doorbell, and you open the door, someone must be there. So with Graves' disease, that receptor gets attacked. And so your thyroid thinks someone's ringing the doorbell, but there's no one there. So it keeps on cranking out hormone. But the receptor it's only a few molecules different than the building blocks that get attacked with Hashimoto's. So the diseases are almost the same thing, and they lead to completely different results. But some people even have both at the same time. That's a rather common scenario as well.
Oh my gosh, to basically have hypo and hyperthyroid at the same time?
Well, they can have the attack against the receptor and then also an attack against the insides where stuff gets built. And so Graves' disease, another funny, odd thing, counterintuitive, is that, Graves' disease can be short-term life-threatening. You can have your heart give out. There's Graves' eye disease, which can lead to permanent vision damage. There's damage to the bones that can occur from it, brain damage. It's no type of thyroid disease is insignificant, but Graves can be deadly in the short term. And having said that, with adequate treatment, with adequate normalization of thyroid levels, over 95% of Graves' disease completely resets itself within 18 months. It can completely shut itself off. And the difference is that if someone has Graves' and Hashimoto's, when the Graves' process stops, they're probably then going to have the thyroid slow down. Whereas if someone has Graves' without the Hashimoto's tendencies, it may just shut off, and they may have just normal thyroid function on their own again afterward.
So looking at someone who has a thyroid issue, whether it's Hashimoto's or Graves', or just whether maybe it's not an autoimmune, but there's something going on and there's an imbalance in the thyroid.
Can I expand on that for just 1 second?
Yes,
Sorry.
absolutely, absolutely.
So this is an awesome point. So yeah, people that say, well, I have hypothyroidism, but I don't have Hashimoto's. Well, Hashimoto's an autoimmune disease. It's the kind of thing you can see it when you see it, but when you don't see it, you don't know that it's not there. I just flew to LA quickly yesterday and I saw they had in the airport pictures of their mountain lion that's around in some of the trails and the parks, and that's kind of cool. They're like celebrating that. And if you saw one, you know they're around. But if you didn't see one, you don't know that they're not around. So people have hypothyroidism, and sometimes the doctor may test their thyroid antibodies. And half the time, the thyroid antibodies are negative. But people that have Hashimoto's disease, half the time, their thyroid antibodies never show up. So there's very few causes of hypothyroidism that are not autoimmune.
Oh,
There
wow.
are people that have had their thyroid gland removed for other reasons, or they've had radiation to the thyroid, or they've been on a couple of medications that inadvertently hurt their thyroid. Those cases exist, but they're rather rare. So by and large, if someone's got hypothyroidism, they've got autoimmune disease unless proven otherwise.
Okay, that's very, very interesting. So, those with thyroid issues across the board.
There's a few more obscure things like thyroiditis, like infectious thyroiditis, like subacute thyroiditis or Riddle's thyroiditis, or there's toxic nodular goiter, there's some thyroid cancers. But if you were to take just those that label as thyroid disease, 90%, well, actually, well over 99% would come under the rubric of either hypo or hyperthyroidism.
Hmm.
And over 98 to 99% of those are caused by autoimmune thyroid disease.
And of those people who have that,
Mhm.
can they go through a treatment and come out the other side eventually with a balanced thyroid, not on medication?
Yeah, so that's a great question. That's a super important people ask is that, hey, can I get cured of this? And I like to just expand that out into two different definitions. So one definition is, for starters, let's just like not talk about which pills you take in the morning because, I take a couple pills and I change those here and there, and I probably always will take a pill or two. So but that's okay. So for starters, I say, let's just not worry about which pills or how many pills you take in the morning, but can you feel as good or maybe better than you did before this started? So that's one definition of cure. And that one I would say, boy, barring the most unusual circumstances, which I don't think I've seen yet, then yes, you can be cured. You can have these symptoms really go away. You might be taking a pill, but you could feel as well as you did before then.
And when you say pill, it could be a supplement, it could be something like the natural version of thyroid that we talked about
Exactly.
earlier. So it can be something on the holistic end, or it could be a pharmaceutical.
Correct. So as long as we're saying that there's a pill somewhere, we're not going to stress about that for right now, then
Hmm.
yes, that cure is pretty much always possible. Now the other definition is, could I do nothing special for my thyroid? And perhaps just be aware of diet, iodine, things like that, and not take any targeted pill for it and have it work completely fine by itself again. And this is a funny one. So Graves' disease, the part about being hyperthyroid perpetuates the autoimmune attack. So if you can pull them out of hyperthyroidism, yeah, then 95% of them reset within 18 months and they're fine. They're not hyperthyroid. Now there's also a hypothyroid autoimmune loop. So we just kind of touched on the before about using thyroid medicine as an appropriate crutch to help a bad leg heal. And so if you can move someone out of hypothyroidism, then a good percent of the time, they also do reset. The numbers aren't as consistent that way. Even without treatment, Hashimoto's disease completely goes away about 26% of the time, you know? And that's given rise to a lot of things that may not be effective, but somebody somewhere pulled on a pair of green socks on a Tuesday and their Hashimoto's went away. And so then they wrote a story about that. Hey, look, this cured my Hashimoto's. And like, well, you were probably in that 26%. It probably wasn't the socks. So you will see odd things that may not be helpful, but seem to be a factor for that one person. And with some more appropriate treatment and pulling someone out of hypothyroidism and getting their iodine right, I would argue that number could readily be in the 50s, the 50% range. So many can get it to where it does just heal up and stay stable again. Those people are still wise to screen and stay on top of it, but that does happen. But when I get that question, I encourage my doctors to talk to someone and get deep into the real whys. And if you peel back a few levels, it's really never about the pill. It's really not about, do I have to take a pill for my thyroid? The question is always, can I be vital and happy and thriving again? And I say, yeah, focus on that one. If it's all about the pill count, just quit taking some random pill and then you're fine. But it's really not about the pill count. It's really about how you're going to feel and function.
Mm-hmm. We're all wanting to get to optimal health.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a listener of the show who shared with me that about 5 or 6 years ago, she was put on a thyroid medication. I'm not sure which one it was. And she wasn't told much about what I think they just said you need more thyroid. Your thyroid isn't making enough, you need more. And they have not changed her medication in 6 years. They haven't tested. She went back and said, "Hey, do I still need to be on this?" And the doctor said, this was an MD. "Do I still need to be on this? Shouldn't we like test and maybe change the dose or whatever?" And the doctor said, "How are you feeling? Do you feel fine?" "Yeah." "Okay, we're not changing anything." And her, are you feeling tired? Are you feeling this? Are you feeling that? "Okay, no, we're not changing anything." But they weren't like testing. And that got me concerned because she definitely has symptoms, but which she's cleared up a lot of them through shifting her diet and lifestyle and taking some great nutritional supplements. She's seen great health improvements, but in the last 6 years, no doctor's has tested whether she should still be on this medication, whether it's the right dose. And I thought that was really irresponsible. Can you kind of walk us through what we should really know about advocating for ourselves when it comes to being on thyroid medication?
For sure. That's a great point. And that's an example. It's sad that those things happen a lot. And those are not examples of bad conventional guidelines. That's not the problem at all. Those are examples of people not following existing guidelines. So the most stodgy conservative conventional guidelines encourage at least annual monitoring for those that have thyroid disease. And of course, the patient's well-being is like just front and center of all of our concerns, but thyroid levels also affect health in ways that you wouldn't know based upon symptoms alone. Your TSH, for example, it's a growth signal to your thyroid, but it's also a growth signal to melanoma. So if it's too high, you've got more risk for that.
Oh my
And it's
gosh.
also a factor that creates risk for fatty liver disease and heart disease and diabetes. So your thyroid scores matter as far as tools to say why you may not be feeling well, but they're affecting your health in many other ways. So they're important to keep healthy and keep dialed in for sure.
Wow. So monitoring annually to make sure that we're not getting too much, not getting too little, we're getting the Goldilocks effect.
Yeah, those are conventional guidelines at a minimum. And in our patients that stabilize, we move into twice a year checking. Once is more cursory and once is more thorough when they're really dialed in. But the point about other symptoms was important that you mentioned as well. There's oftentimes where there may be some less obvious symptoms that are being affected by that. And then the other issue that really gets me about screening is that we're concerned about some things disproportionately over others. So, cancer is a valid concern for pretty much all ages and groups. There's a lot of thought about some cancers. We think quite a bit about breast or prostate. The cancer that's growing the fastest amongst women is thyroid cancer. The rates have gone up, no exaggeration, since, let me just do the math right, the last 3 decades. So yeah, so since the end of the 90s, they've gone up threefold. So 3 times increase.
What?
You can you can take a
Crazy.
graph of the rate of breast, ovarian, colorectal, prostate, lung cancer, leukemias, lymphomas, and you can map them for the last 50 years. Besides some little itty bitty fluctuations here and there, they've more or less flatlined. And thyroid disease is like on jet fuel. I mean, thyroid cancer is just exploding. People with thyroid disease should have a minimum of a baseline ultrasound and a thyroid exam. If there's anything at all weird about either of those, they should have a minimum of an annual ultrasound for tracking. And I would crudely estimate based on no good numbers other than just like see the pants guesses from talking to a lot of people. that maybe 5% of people with thyroid disease have had screening ultrasounds done. In our practice, every other week, I think we have a story about one of the doctors who, we just know that when someone comes in, most people have been on treatment for decades, and we know that almost none have ever had ultrasounds. We're resigned to that, but at least every other week, there's someone that we'll catch that has active, sometimes sadly advanced thyroid cancer because no one checked for it. So that's the other big part of just regular screening for someone.
So if someone is not, let's say someone has relatively healthy thyroid levels in their blood work, they're not on a thyroid medication, are they less likely to develop thyroid cancer than those who are on medication or do have a need for medication?
Yeah, you're so smart. I love the distinctions you make. So you're right. The medication doesn't cause that, but the need for medication and having the really high TSH levels, that's the driver. So the TSH tells your thyroid to work, and if your thyroid slows down, your TSH yells at it. And the problem is that if you yell at it for a long time and you can't grow healthy cells, any weird cells you got, they grow like crazy. It's like you got a garden full of weeds and you put Miracle-Gro on it. So that's because your thyroid is not working well. It's got a greater chance of having unhealthy cells there already. And so now if you've got a stronger growth signal, that sets the stage for it. So yeah, those that aren't in those categories, the risks are a lot lower. But even at that, the American College of Gynecology recommends self-neck checks on a monthly basis. And we also don't hear about those. Thankfully, self-breast exam messages have gotten out. They're totally appropriate. But at the same time, head north for a minute and do a neck check while you're at it as well. I can give you a link afterward to a video explaining how to do those. They're really simple to do at home.
Oh, wonderful. I'll make sure that's in the show notes. I love your YouTube videos. I highly recommend all listeners checking out Dr. Alan Christianson's YouTube videos. They're wonderful, very informative and easy to digest, so I applaud you on that. Now, what about nutrient deficiencies? I still want to talk about this thyroid cancer epidemic. The fact that it has gone up threefold since the 90s is really alarming. Are there any nutrient deficiencies that have been linked to causing the increase in thyroid cancer, like a deficiency in selenium, for example?
There's been some data that is relevant. It's probably not the smoking gun, but selenium is super important for all things thyroid. As exacting as iodine is, it turns out that, not everyone who gets too much iodine gets sick from that. And when you've got adequate selenium, you can get by on an amount of iodine that may not be ideal a bit better. So iodine deficiency is more pronounced. If you got a population of people, 1,000 people who are all iodine deficient, those who are also lower in selenium are more apt to have problems with iodine deficiency. And then vice versa. If a lot of folks get too much iodine, it's those who are lower in selenium who are most apt to manifest issues and side effects from that. And there also has been data about the deficiency being a susceptibility for thyroid cancers as well, especially the papillary type.
Well, it's interesting that selenium acts like almost like a shield, a protectant to help make those very narrow ranges of iodine less narrow.
Exactly.
That's cool. Now, why do you think thyroid cancer has increased in such a short span of time? Do you think it's environmental? I mean, obviously can't be genetic. I mean, since the 90s, right?
Yeah.
Something doesn't, a disease doesn't pop up that much if it's genetic. And so are we
We didn't
looking
get a
at,
firmware update on our genes or
right,
anything.
our genes didn't all of a sudden like this giant epigenetic shift for everyone, unless, we're massively on a mass level exposed to some kind of chemical or nutrient deficiency. So I'm thinking glyphosate, Roundup. I mean, what have we been massively exposed to? Flu vaccines? Like, what is it that's popped up since the 90s that almost everyone's being exposed to that is now increasing thyroid cancer?
But the funny thing about cancers in general, and this is different for different cell types for their rate of growth, but what happens is that there may be a long time before they really emerge, even though the growth rate is constant. So have you ever heard the thing about there was some story about a wise man who did some good favor for the king, and the king said, name your wish, it'll be yours. And I think there was a chessboard involved in this, and the guy said, I just want, on this board, I just want a grain of rice on the first square and then double for each square. And I asked for nothing more than that. Have you ever heard this before?
I haven't, but I'm seeing where you're going because I've heard the, double a penny every day
Doubling.
for a year kind of thing.
Yeah, totally. So like 64 squares in a chessboard. So before you end up at the chessboard, you would, you're like some quadrillion numbers of grains of rice. It's like the mass of the planet Earth or something. It's ridiculous. But so cancer doubles. And somewhere along the way, our best understanding is that there's a cell that just doesn't listen to this message of apoptosis. And we're always making new cells. And the collective group of cells says, hey, that's enough. We don't need any more new ones. And if there's some that are popping up premature, that one says, oh, okay, I'll take one for the team and do myself in. And that's apoptosis. And some cells just don't pay attention to that and they keep on dividing. And so you got one bad cell and that becomes 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 56. And for a long time, it's microscopic. But then all of a sudden, something microscopic becomes pinhead, and the pinhead becomes like a little garden pea, and the pea becomes a golf ball, and the golf ball becomes a softball. So the growth rate is constant, but the mass becomes exponential. And with thyroid cancer, the whole cycle from onset to manifestation is thought to be somewhere around like 30 to 50 years. It's like a really slow process.
Wow.
So then the question becomes, what was happening in the 60s, and in the 70s, what was going on then? And I've not studied this question in the last couple of years. So there may be some good answers that I've not seen that are more current, but there wasn't so much a smoking gun, but the collective environmental burden is definitely thought to be a big factor. And it's not so much what happened to someone as recently, but more so what happened to people early in life that is now manifesting later on.
Like what?
Well, in terms of that time frame, we had a lot of new onset of industrial chemicals in general. We still had a really high lead burden that was present. There were many more pesticides coming into play, many more plastic compounds. So there's a lot of possible contenders. And what's the other great issue that this brings up that's also unique and weird about the thyroid and iodine, remember that pump, how we pumped in iodine? So that pump is not flawlessly selective. And the thyroid is the ultimate canary in the coal mine for environmental junk because a lot of things get snagged in that pump. And not only do they end up in the thyroid, they get concentrated in the thyroid.
Oh, interesting. I never think of the thyroid in that way. We always think the liver, right? That's where all the toxins go. But
No, the liver's important, but the liver stuff is always, and that's like a super important organ I think a lot about. But no, the thyroid is the only one that actually concentrates things inside of it. The liver, some things get stuck, but they're still at the blood level of concentration. The thyroid, it can be 50 or 100-fold over the blood level.
right, because that's its job.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've got all these foreign chemicals the body doesn't know what to do with, and it gets stuck in the thyroid. The thyroid's job is to concentrate.
Yep.
So now it's yeah.
Some of those things cause DNA damage and long-term cancers. Others just make the thyroid irritated enough to make it engender the immune system's attention and start the autoimmune cascade.
Oh my gosh, we need a thyroid detox.
Yeah.
Here we go. That's your next book. Is there any concern for nutrient deficient? I mean, beyond iodine, beyond like the goiter, is there any concern about nutrient deficiency causing thyroid issues like your B vitamins or minerals, amino acids, fatty acids? Is there anything that we can say, yeah, if you are nutrient deficient, you're more likely to be overall have thyroid problems, or is that as big of a deal?
Well, I'd love to answer that and say that there was, many myriad of factors that were known to be relevant. Really not so much. And for sure, it's important not to be micronutrient deficient for dozens of reasons. But apart from these big ones, the thyroid's pretty hardy. Some things can play with how functional the gland is and how well the body receives and uses the hormones. Iron deficiency anemias can be big that way. Low magnesium can be a factor. There's data back and forth about vitamin D status being relevant to the risk of autoimmune onset. So that can be something. Zinc is used for a lot of enzymes for forming and breaking down hormones. But as far as like the big smoking gun, then yeah, iodine and selenium are the tops of the list.
Cool. Very cool. And I just want to point out, if listeners have been listening to you going, I wish this guy was my doctor, you can be. You have a whole team of amazing doctors that focus on holistic medicine and helping people to live the absolute healthiest life they could possibly live, hopefully off of medication if their body agrees with that. But that's your goal, is to help people live super healthy, and that you have an amazing clinic and you work with people. So I just want to point that out, that you know, we could all have you and your team on our team to help us get healthy, instead of us kind of feeling overwhelmed or, bumping through the dark. I always like to use the analogy of, like, sometimes we feel like we're throwing darts at a dartboard blindfolded. We're doing what's that bird show that's on Netflix everyone's freaking out about? I'm way too scared to watch it, but
I don't know.
bird box, where they're doing the
Oh,
bird
I've
box
seen that
challenge.
talked about. I don't know what that means
It's
though. Okay.
well, it's the everyone is wearing a blindfold the whole movie, because there's a monster that'll kill them if they
Wow.
yeah, I know. I wouldn't watch it. My adrenals, I have too much respect for my adrenal glands. But yeah, I mean, that's how I feel. So we're all like blindfolded, walking around going, okay, well, I guess I'm gonna eat more oranges because I need vitamin C, or should I take a vitamin C tablet? I don't know. So there's a lot of guesswork when it comes to trying to do holistic medicine. And even when we go out and read all these books and learn from all these experts that have all this conflicting information, it leaves us more confused than ever. And then if we go to an MD, it's we don't feel like they're exploring, or they have all the tools in their tool belt. So that's why I love naturopathic medicine, because you're incorporating the latest science and looking at all the holistic medicine and all the ways we can support the body to come back into balance and stop with the guesswork. So,
And what we're super excited about is that now with the telemedicine movement, we can connect with people wherever they are.
mhm.
So those that do end up coming under our longer term care, and it is appropriate for us to manage their medications, we do see them just once in person. But short of that, anyone can do a telemedicine consult and just talk to one of the doctors and see what their basic needs are and see if that's a direction they need to pursue or not. So yeah, we're jazzed to have that available for people.
Absolutely. And it makes sense to go down and see you, especially since you do the scan of the thyroid, the ultrasound of the thyroid, you're touching the person's neck, and you're seeing them physically for a reason. And also, it's super nice to look someone straight in the eye and kind of get a feel of their energy and feel like you're finally being heard by someone, you
For
know?
sure, that's huge.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about the thyroid. For those who suspect they have a thyroid problem but aren't on medication yet, can you give us the rundown as to what they should do to make sure that they are healthy and don't need medication, or that they, what kind of symptoms would show up, and what kind of tests should they initially ask their doctor to do?
Yeah, so symptoms that show up, a big distinction is that these are symptoms that are distinct over some time frame. So there was a thing called the Colorado Thyroid Prevalence Study done in 98, I think, or 2000, and they tracked 12,000 people at a health fair in Colorado, and they mapped out symptoms, and they did thyroid tests on everyone, and they saw which symptoms were the strongest predictors. And a
Hmm.
lot of symptoms were worded in two ways. Like they would say, do you have a hoarse throat, hoarse voice, or do you have a hoarser voice? Have you had hair loss, or are you having more hair loss? And it seemed that a lot of the more symptoms were much stronger statistical predictors. So there's some things that we've all got our fuses, our weak spots, whatever. The things we've had all along may be relevant, but are a little less suspicious. But the things you can point back and say, yeah, ever since last November, it's gone downhill in this way. That's really
Hmm.
suspicious. And there's like a set time frame. So from this study, the strongest that's finding something, there's symptoms that predict thyroid disease, and then there's a lack of symptoms that would point you away from thyroid disease. So kind of like the rule in and rule out.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some strongly predictive symptoms, and that's some of the classic ones, like the unexplained weight gain, unexplained fatigue, the dry skin, the hair loss. Some are less classic, such as constipation or muscle cramps or voice hoarseness or difficulty swallowing. Those are some big ones too. Now, the funny thing about thyroid symptoms is that this study looked at how many symptoms people had and how common certain symptoms were. And there's no symptom that you have to have. So I've heard a lot of people say, I've thought it could have been my thyroid, but I really don't have a problem gaining weight, so it must not be that. I'm like, no, you don't get, people don't get all the symptoms. They get a couple symptoms, and there's a unique combination. So the negative predictive value, are there any symptoms that if you, in their absence, would point you away from thyroid disease? There are none. There are no statistically powerful negative predictive symptoms. So nothing you can say, oh, if I don't have that, it must not be it. But a lot of possible symptoms point toward it. Now, in terms of things you can test, I've written a lot about this. You can find much longer lists. Honestly, it's most important to get a screen for your TSH and your thyroid antibodies. And it's then important to know not just what's normal, but what should optimal look like. So thyroid antibodies, when I started practicing, they did that test in 2 levels. The first level was, were they positive or negative? And if they were positive, they would then put a number on that. Now what they do is they have a normal range. So there's a certain amount of thyroid antibodies that are considered perfectly fine. And there's been a lot of editorials written about the error and the folly in that. You don't want to attack your thyroid at all. So thyroid antibodies, you want them screened. If they're somewhere besides 0, that's not good. That's some level of an autoimmune attack. And for sure, really high is different than low, but some is different than none, and some is not good. So there's that. Then there's the TSH. Now this is another opposite day thing. So this is how much your brain wants your thyroid to work. And let's think this through. If your thyroid were completely goofing off, think about the thyroid is like a worker, and this is like some office sitcom, and the boss is a blowhard, and the worker's goofing off at the water cooler. So the boss yells at him, So that's what happens when the thyroid gets low, is the signal from the pituitary becomes elevated. That's the boss yelling. It's saying, hey, get to work. And so the TSH is backward. In the case of the thyroid being overactive, the TSH is really low. It may be almost close to 0. So the TSH is backward. And there's a normal range, but there's so much data. I was just looking at a few studies this last week. There's so many good studies showing that the normal range does fail in the sense that it's too broad. So the range is the common scores we see in people that get thyroid tests. But people that get thyroid tests get them because they should. They've got thyroid disease, they're on treatment, they're symptomatic. So the number of people who have thyroid problems are much greater than the people that have perfect thyroid function when it comes to who's getting tests done. And the averages reflect that. So,
oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Okay, so wait, we have to pause just to really drive this point home. So when you look at your blood score, like, everyone gets a physical hopefully near the beginning of the year because it's kind of a fun time to do it, and you get this big printout and your doctor goes over it with you, and they're like, okay, your blood sugar is here and these are the normal ranges and you're kind of within the normal range, so that's good, and here's your estrogen and it's a little low but it's still within normal range. And so all these ranges are not based on optimal health.
Well, this is funny. So they're actually all different in terms of how they're derived. There are some ranges that are the product of a lot of deliberation, to where, like, the JNC7 establishes where blood pressure should be. And there's always changes and refinements about blood glucose levels. But then other ranges are averages in the population. So I don't know much more about sports than I do about current TV, but we've got the Phoenix Suns that play basketball here. And I know for sure that if you went to the Suns locker room and averaged the height of these young men, and then you took that average number, that I'm slightly taller than average for the general population, but I would be a shrimp compared to the average would be from these guys. So that's how a range can be biased based on where it comes from.
Oh my gosh. And our whole, everyone wants optimal health and wants their ranges to be compared to what optimal health looks like.
Yeah.
But if they're deriving the ranges of what healthy hormones are based on the population, and the population that gets these tests done the most are sick,
You got it.
then our ranges of quote unquote the healthy ranges are actually skewed. They're off. And this is, again, I love going to naturopaths, and because when I get my blood work done, we sit down for an hour and it gets explained to me, and the naturopath will go like, okay, well, an MD would have said 30 for your vitamin D is fine, but I want to see you at 60, that kind of thing. And she'll point out each one as we go down this lab. She'll be like, well, the lab says this is the healthy range, but this is not the healthy range. This is the naturopathic healthy range, and we want to get you here. And what ranges are healthy? Not the average of the sick people. We don't want to be a statistic. I don't want to be the average. If you're an average, you're likely to get cancer, you're likely to get diabetes or obesity. I don't want to be an average. I want to be optimal. So what are the optimal
Yeah.
ranges?
So I mentioned the antibodies, they should be 0. And there are other thyroid tests. You hear a lot about the T4 and the T3. I didn't go into those on purpose. When you look at the healthiest populations, their average scores for T4 and T3 pretty much are the average scores in the blood tests. There's a lot of reasons for that are not important to go into, but the TSH is quite different. So the TSH, remember again, it's backward. So an overactive thyroid is a low TSH, underactive is a high TSH. Now the low end of the range, there have been several big studies that have taken healthy populations that don't have thyroid issues and found what their average scores were. And the low end of their range pretty much is the low end of the normal range for the population getting tested. That's between about 0.35 and 0.4. You call it 0.4, there's not a significant difference. So about 0.4 is the bottom end of the safe, healthy range. And below that, we're getting hyperthyroid. Remember, it's backward. Now, it all changes on the other end, and this is the big disconnect between normal and optimal. So when I started practicing, the normal value for TSH on the upper end was 12, and that inched down to 10. I'll still see some that come back with the normal range saying it's 5.5 or 7, but in most cases now it's 4.5. So typically 0.4 to 4.5 is the normal range for a TSH. And there's just so many bodies of evidence saying that healthy people don't have TSH scores above 2. It just doesn't show up in healthy populations. So you can be pretty much smack dab in the middle of the range, but not be congruent with where your scores would be if you were compared to healthy people. So yeah, above 2 for a TSH is not consistent with optimal thyroid function.
Got it. But 0.5 could someone be totally healthy and be 0.5? Like you're saying 0.4
Yes.
and below is so is it 0.4 is hyper or
below 0.4 would be hyper.
So you could be 0.4 and it's like perfect, fine, I'm happy with that.
Yeah, and this is when you're on the edges, we start thinking about other symptoms and some other markers or whatnot, but by and large, that's good. And then also, I guess there's like 3 ways to think about this. So one way is if we're diagnosing someone who's not on any treatment and we're saying, are you abnormal or not? And the other way to think about this is, what predicts, let's forget about symptoms, what predicts long-term health outcomes? And 0.4 wins on both of those counts. If you're below 0.4, there are complications that emerge. Even if there's no other obvious signs of thyroid disease, that itself is dangerous. Now, the other variable is how does this differ for someone who is on thyroid treatment? And in that case, then it seems to get even a little bit tighter. That's probably about 0.5 to 1.5. And then we think about those that have had thyroid cancer, those that have nodules or goiters, and that can refine it a bit more still. But yet, if someone's just thinking about their symptoms and whether or not there could be a thyroid issue, they shouldn't fall outside of 0.4 to 2.0 for their TSH scores.
Fascinating. What about free T3 and free T4?
Yeah, big can of worms. I'll open it a little bit. The short version is that many have heard that discussion about the TSH to where low is more consistent with optimal, and they've then assumed that that could be carried over to T4 and T3, that if healthy people have lower TSHs and the TSH is inverse, then they should have higher levels of T3 and T4 because those are not inverse. And T3 and T4, what happens is they're highly regulated by the body, and they only reflect the state when the body's off by extremes. So the TSH, for example, if your TSH gets to be hyperthyroid and you're at 0.2 or 0.1, you wouldn't likely see your T3 elevate. And what's happening is first your body is telling the thyroid to make less, but as you do that, you're also working hard to eliminate thyroid hormone faster. You're using other things, other tricks to keep the T3 and T4 levels close to where they should be. It's only after the TSH is as low as it can be and then some that the T3 hormones start to elevate. And it's the same thing on the other side. When someone's hypothyroid, the T3, T4, they don't drop off right away. They may even get higher. The body may even preferentially make more T3. It might get the opposite of what you would think. So we don't put as much diagnostic weight on those, and that's a way in which we do things quite differently. There are a lot of doctors that talk about needing to have high levels of T3 and trying to get there. The drawback is you never get there unless you have the TSH too low. And there's a lot of evidence that say that being on the high side of normal for T3 and T4, that does correlate with complications of hyperthyroidism.
Now, you mentioned T2. Is that something we
Yeah.
test for?
Sadly, it's not measurable. And we know that it's present in desiccated thyroid. We know that healthy people have good amounts of that. And we also have evidence saying that people who are on thyroid treatment that does not include T2 tend to be lacking in it. But there's not commercial tests available. So T2 by itself seems to have the largest roles to play in metabolic rate and also with regulating ovarian function. So if someone's on T4 or T4 and T3 or T3 only, and they may be treated well by other metrics, but they're still struggling in those ways, then that could be one more reason that they could do better on desiccated thyroid, which contains T2.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. Are there any other tests that we should know about?
Those are really the big ones for thyroid function. There are many, many others, but honestly, they're not ones that change how we go about doing things as far as the function. The structure, that's really about the ultrasound and the doctor's exam, super important, underutilized, but yeah, those are the real mainstays.
All right, so pretend that we're your new patient and we have a thyroid issue. We've come to see you in your beautiful clinic. Walk us through what you would do with us.
The first thing is really just understanding what this means and how this has affected you. And there's layers of that. We always, well, I want my scores to be better. Cool, we will cover that. Why is that important? Well, because now I'm more tired. Well, great. So how has that affected your life? So we always want to really peel back and get to the deepest why. And the deepest why often comes down to, how we connect with our loved ones, how we're living our mission here on this planet, how well we can be of service to others. And once we get that strong connection, then we've got the real anchor. Like, okay, so this is the goal. This we want to see shift. This is the most important part about that. And then we really get really clear on what that should look like and have them identify on how that would be in an ideal state for them and have that be the ultimate goal. It's not about the labs or the numbers. It's about, being there for the grandkids at prom or being able to play with a 2-year-old more effectively or feeling confident about walking out in the favorite outfit, just getting down to those core issues. That's what it's really all about. Everything else is just tactics. Everything
Mm-hmm.
past that point is just how do we make this work? But that's like priority one. Is like what has this done in your life and what has this held you back from? And what would things look like if this weren't an issue? And maybe even beyond that, if things were ideal for you, how would that look and play out? So that's like the most important thing for us to sort out.
That's brilliant because it anchors them in what they actually want to see change in their life, and then they can measure that. They know it's working. Then they're sticking with your program, and 6 months into your program, they're like, "Wow, I'm doing the things I said in our first sit
Yeah.
down with you that I wanted to do. Things are moving." I know, like when someone's on a weight loss, for example, and they get on the scale and only says that they lost 0.5 pounds, or maybe it says they didn't lose anything at all, but we go up and down like 5 pounds in water weight sometimes in a day. And so they could have lost some fat, but it doesn't show, or maybe they gain muscle. And so if we stare at that number on the scale, it can really piss us off
Yeah.
if that's all we're gauging, right? But you said don't look at the numbers, look at, where do you want to be in life? What activities do you want to do? And yeah. And so if you're on this diet and 3 weeks in, your goal was to feel more flexible, to be able to touch your toes and not, hurt, to be able to walk and not feel creaky knees, to be able to easily move into the car, sit down into the car and or fit into seats, or get into your clothing and not feel tight, or feel energized after a meal. And so if you made this list and then 3 weeks into a diet, you start feeling great, you're like, okay, don't even look at the scale. It's working. I had a friend once, I gave her a diet book, really good, well balanced, here's how to eat healthy. And it says in the book, the first thing is you have to do this for at least 30 days. Like, and it's like a whole foods, very, very nice diet, but you have to do it for at least 30 days before you judge it. And within, I think and somewhere in the third week, she gave up because she didn't lose any weight. But I said, well, did you notice anything? She goes, well, yeah, my rings were falling off. And I'm like, your body was getting, like, the inflammation was coming down, like you were starting. And she was saying, oh yeah, I felt great, I had energy, my rings were falling off, but I didn't lose any weight, so it's not working. I'm going to stop this diet. And
Classic example.
right? I thought that was really interesting. So I love the advice you gave us. The first thing we do is, as thyroid patients, is to write down all the things that we don't like about our health right now and how it limits us, and then write down or talk about, and then write down, what would it be like without these limitations? What do I really want? And get firm on that you really want. So as you are achieving it, it's working.
And I've seen some people that, you mentioned the one doctor who said, are you feeling okay? Let's call it good. I've seen that a lot in the natural space too, in the thyroid world, to where they'll take it further and they'll even say, if you seem to feel well in the short term, we can even ignore these tests. Even if the tests say you're getting too much, something is wrong, we're more concerned about you than we are about the tests. And I talk about this one like, let's say that where you want to be, let's throw a metaphor. Maybe this is like being at the ocean, and that's what your ideal health would look like a trip to the ocean. Like, okay, cool. So the goal is to get to the ocean, and smell the salt air and have your toes in the sand and all that. But we've got to drive there. And we've got to know which way to turn. And the tough part about symptoms all by themselves is that symptoms are, just red lights in the dashboard. They're saying something is wrong, but they don't tell us which way to turn. So we have to still have data and have good things to know, like use our GPS. We got to know which way to turn. But the goal, we're not, when the GPS says you have arrived, like, oh, okay, cool, we're all finished. No, then we get out of the car and go to the beach, So we still need the data. We still have to act upon that, but that's not the highest goal. That's just a tool to get to what matters.
Exactly. I love it. I love it. I love the perspective you're giving us. Awesome. So after you help us with that, then what? Then what does it look like to work with you?
Well, most people that do come in, that's the top concern. And what happens is that there's many facets of health that are wrapped within that. Hormones are affected by hormones. They all overlap so much. So the thyroid is one to where it has a lot of effects upon the others. So when that's dialed in, a lot of other things do better. But there certainly are times to where other issues are more foreshadow thyroid problems, where they can coexist along with thyroid problems. So helping those along as well. And we think about the health of the adrenal glands, the health of the ovaries and the testicles, the pineal gland, the pancreas, the blood sugar regulation, the liver. So yeah, all the glands and the hormones are a big focus. And I really see the hormones as like the place to where lifestyle connects with the overall health span, how long you'll be healthy. So hormones are the intersection of those two things.
What are common problems that often accompany thyroid? And like, let's say someone comes in with, like you said, like diabetes and thyroid problems. Are you going to address both of them at the same time? Or is thyroid the most important thing to correct first, and then sometimes other things correct because you corrected the thyroid?
The latter is quite true. And at the same time, there are some steps that can help both at the same time. And there's few things that would help one gland that would set back another. So you'll hear some people talk about certain orders of, thyroid and adrenals, but yeah, there's few times where I worry about a proper order, because the helpful steps will only be good for the other glands. But the case you mentioned of thyroid and diabetes, there's a lot of overlap. I threw out the term thyroiditis one time in an article, but it goes both ways. Diabetics get more thyroid disease that have that get much more diabetes, and correcting thyroid levels helps blood sugar greatly. So yeah, that's hugely important towards that.
Why do you think that those with thyroid problems are more susceptible to having diabetes?
Well, the thyroid is one of the main things that governs how readily the body converts fuel into energy. And
Mm,
diabetes, the emergent term for diabetes now in medical literature is leaky liver.
mm-hmm.
So it's less thought of as about a disease of a broken pancreas that can't make insulin, apart from type 1 diabetes. But by and large, type 2 and metabolic syndrome, it's a state to where the liver's gotten so jammed with stuff that it's leaking something out all the time. And yeah, thyroid hormones can have strong effects upon how well the liver can burn fuel.
Mm. What are your thoughts on fasting? If someone comes in and I mean, with all these, the body's just doing some crazy stuff with everything. I've heard that if they go on a water only fast, the body kind of resets itself. Have you ever seen any positive results with water only fasting correcting the thyroid?
Um, I've not heard about any or read about that. I've heard certainly many talk about various health changes from that. And the idea, the caveat I put out for anything is that, in medical research, we know what we know what we study, we don't know what we haven't studied. And if ever someone's done something that's worked for them and they're in better shape for that, that's awesome. I'm completely supportive of that. But my job as I see it is to figure out, what's most likely to work for someone who's already tried a lot of things. And so
Mm-hmm.
I look at big studies and do my best to make inferences out of that.
Mm-hmm.
And fasting, the idea is that you're challenging the body to do something harder. If it can't manage blood sugar, if you take in nothing and make it do it all by itself, it's almost like the idea of exercise. But the pitfall about a chosen stressor is that, is it the right amount or is it too much? If a system has too much
Mm.
strain already, is that going to be helpful for it or hinder it? In thyroid hormones, for example, in the fasted state, one of the first steps that occurs is we stop activating thyroid hormones. That's one of the ways the body slows the metabolic rate intentionally. So anything that does slow the thyroid does run a risk of worsening or unmasking that autoimmune response. Once the thyroid is
Mm.
very too slow or too fast, that can set the stage to perpetuate the whole autoimmune cycle. So it's not a mainstay of treatment that we do. If someone's done that and it's worked, that's cool. But yeah, just based on some mechanisms and a lack of data, it's not something that we advise people on.
That brings up another point. What about other stressors like if someone's isn't exercising and then all of a sudden starts a boot camp and that's a large stressor for energy, or switches to something like a ketogenic diet or a very extreme diet.
Yeah.
Do we run the risk of also unmasking and stimulating a thyroid autoimmune problem?
For sure. And the exercise, I've seen less data around that. There certainly are ways that overtraining can cause stress to the adrenals, the cortisol rhythms, and that in turn can affect the thyroid. But as far as direct effects, you mentioned the ketogenic diet, there's so much evidence on that. So thyroid disease is quite rare amongst children. It's much more common each decade with age. But pediatric populations, it may be a few cases per thousand. And that's even true for epileptic pediatric populations. But the group that's done the most research on ketogenic diets is a group that has researched that as a treatment for epilepsy. That's actually
Mm-hmm.
I can pretty much see them looking at my window. It's Barrow's Neurologic Center in Phoenix. And they know repeatedly that they don't start epileptic children on the ketogenic diet. They try medications first. And those that fail medications, they'll do brief attempts of the diet. And the reason they don't lead with it is because upwards of 24% of the children end up needing thyroid treatment when they're put on ketogenic diets.
What about adults?
We don't have large bodies of data, but the bodies of data that we have suggest that there's a similar response. So the body in the state of ketosis has a lot of things that it can do, like in the state of starvation, and not all of those are good. One of which is that we turn down our thermostats radically. If your car is
Mm.
almost out of gas, you're not going to, race the guy at the stoplight. You're going to like just baby it along to the gas station. And your body does that. Your thyroid is the main thing that governs how fast or slow your metabolic rate is. And if there's something challenging your fuel access, like your body thinks it's in starvation state, you will quit activating thyroid hormones. you'll intentionally make yourself hypothyroid. And just like that iodine level changing, sometimes, or the iodine shutting off the gland temporarily, sometimes when it gets pushed off, even in deliberate ways, that's when it comes back wrong. That's when it doesn't boot back up again quite right. And so sometimes those effects are lasting for people.
So, moral of the story, don't do anything extreme.
Yeah, that's a good moral. That's really solid advice.
So cool. What now we were going to get into adrenal health and so I shared with you the last time in episode 307 that for I was diagnosed 10 years ago with chronic adrenal fatigue. My cortisol levels were like ridiculously low. I'm sure you could have compared me to a cadaver. My doctor kind of looked at me shocked and said, "I don't even know how you're awake right now." It was really a rough moment in my life, and it took several
Wow,
years to recover. What was really interesting is the biggest thing that helped me recover is diet and nutrition. I mean, go figure.
that's cool.
Yeah, right. And also same thing, diet and nutrition, like nutritional supplements, trace getting the trace minerals, getting the good vitamins, shifting the diet to be void of crap and full of good stuff. Real general, I'm going for a walk every day, like that kind of, basic, the what we all know is healthy. I
Yeah.
got rid of my diabetes, my chronic adrenal fatigue, my polycystic ovarian syndrome, my lifelong infertility. We conceived a child naturally after trying for 6 years just by making these changes. So that's why I'm a big advocate of using food as medicine and supplements when needed and doing it in balance, not in extremes. And also looking at lifestyle, decreasing stress, increasing movement, but again, not in extremes. Because many of us go to the gym and 2 weeks later injure ourselves and just then give up because we think we have to push ourselves and push to these extremes, right? But it's more
Yeah.
about what we can do sustainably that makes us healthy. And so I've been fascinated with this concept of, adrenal health. And then watching your videos on YouTube, you talk about that there really is no such thing as this disease, but the symptoms are real. And so I'd love for you to get into why is it we have now this epidemic and I see it more in women than men. And I don't know if it's just because women are more vocal about their health and men have been taught since birth to suck it up and men don't
Be tough.
cry. And, like, I don't know if men are just like really silently like suffering, unfortunately, or if this is just affects more women. But we're exhausted, we're living off of coffee, and our hormones are a mess. What's going on?
They're totally real symptoms, and the things we'll talk about driving them are real drivers of that, and a lot of the things we'll talk about correcting that are very real. The there was a quote from one of the first books that popularized this idea, and it mentioned how in this state the adrenals became unable to produce cortisol. And there's a disease called Addison's disease, which is really everything we've talked about Hashimoto's and the thyroid, you could talk about with Addison's and the adrenals. It's the same idea. The immune system attacks it. It can't make enough hormone. So that happens. It's really rare. But at a surface level, surface look, someone with Addison's disease could have very similar cortisol levels to where you were when you were at your worst.
Mm-hmm.
And someone that didn't get the nuance would see them as similar things. And the pitfall about that is if you assume the problem is low cortisol, then somebody somewhere is going to think about just giving more cortisol.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of cases like that, had someone given you a lot of cortisol at your worst, you might have felt a lot better from that in the short term. But you can also measure the brain talking to the adrenals the same way you can measure the brain talking to the thyroid. And the difference between Addison's disease and what we call adrenal fatigue is that in adrenal fatigue, the brain is telling the adrenals to slow down. They're doing what they're told to do. To whereas in Addison's disease, just like in hypothyroidism, the brain is begging them to work harder, but they can't work harder. So it's yelling louder and louder. So
Oh.
the body doesn't want more cortisol. And part of that changes a lot of treatment strategies. And also part of that really changes the prognosis. You realize, hey, I'm not broken. My body just like needs some time to chill. I need some help and some R&R and some recuperation. And I can be as good or better as I was before this started. This is not something I'm stuck with forever. So that's the big distinction I like to draw out. And that's also where the conventional world has had their feathers ruffled by the idea of adrenal fatigue, because it's not a weakness of the adrenals. They're slowing down because the body told them to slow down. And that can correlate with fatigue and with these symptoms and with food cravings and weight struggles and hormonal problems. That's all totally true. And lifestyle things can help with that. But it's just not that they're not making cortisol because they don't want to, not because they can't.
Oh my gosh, what is the test to measure the brain talking to the adrenals?
So that's the ACTH. That's adrenal corticotropic hormone.
Mm-hmm.
It's really readily available. And any listener who's been questioning about or has been told they've got adrenal fatigue and they're not sure if it's weak adrenals or the body trying to slow things down, any lab can run that test. And it's pretty straightforward. If you've got Addison's disease, you'll have low cortisol and ACTH is elevated. It's blatantly above range.
Mm-hmm.
If you have adrenal stress, as I'll call that, you'll have that same low flatline cortisol, but your ACTH is either normal or it's low. Your adrenals are doing exactly what they're told to do.
What are the ranges that you want to see people in when addressing ACTH?
So ACTH, this is when you see a lot of different units per regional labs. Amongst the most common ones, you'll see cutoffs of between like 15 and 18, to where when you're well above that, that's a sign of there being an Addison's response. So in most cases, people will be in the upper single digits or lower double digits. But again, a fair amount of regional variation. But this is a case where the ranges are pretty meaningful. So when you're way above the given range, that's a clear sign the glands are really not working. And when you're within that, then they're okay.
Got it. And is there a too low of a level?
Well, so the opposite can happen. And the same way that with hyperthyroidism, the TSH can go low, there are some Cushing's diseases and Cushingoid states in which someone is making too much cortisol, or they're taking like prednisone or things that are kind of like cortisol. And yes, those in turn can cause ACTH to get pushed down below 3 or 4. But that's pretty unusual. That's more so in a specific circumstance like that.
Got it. Are there any raw building blocks the body needs to make sure that the body can make these hormones? So, the common one we all know is the body uses those healthy fats to make our sex hormones and our stress hormones. But when we're really deficient, and then the body goes, well, I guess we're robbing from the sex hormones to make the stress hormones. So are there raw building blocks that we might have to make sure that we're consuming in our diet so that we support the body in making these hormones?
There are raw building blocks that are important, but they're ones that we do manufacture as needed. And there's really not common cases in which they themselves are the problem. So like low cortisol, for example, even in cases of Addison's disease, it's not a lack of cortisol, or I'm sorry, it's not a lack of cholesterol, because that's really the one compound that's the backbone of all those hormones. Funny thing is somewhere around your waist, below your waist, all the hormones are made out of cholesterol. Above the waist, all the hormones that are made out of protein peptides, protein chains. So yeah, all the steroid hormones are hormones that are built from modified cholesterol. But we make cholesterol. So it's never a lack of cholesterol that causes a lack of hormones in the body.
I love that. I never thought of it that way, that all the hormones below the waist are steroid.
Yeah, that's a fun thing. I've never really heard that
interesting.
elsewhere. But yeah, below the waist and above the waist. Above the waist, you've got like insulin and growth hormone and thyroid hormones and melatonin. They're all protein peptides. Below the waist, the adrenals, the ovaries, the testicles. That's all. That's where all the steroids come from. And
It's so funny. I mean, I don't normally get really like religious on the show, but if one were to believe in God, which I do, I always thought that God was the coolest scientist, and I just imagine him in his lab as he was making mankind, going, I'm gonna like just put these little weird clues in it, and I wonder how long it'll take them to figure this out. Like the one day they'll just go, what? Like everything below the waist is steroid, everything above the waist is peptides. Like what's up with that? So
you might like this. When I was newly into medical school, my mom's mom, my maternal grandmother, I was visiting her and just talking about all the things I was learning, and she said, well, isn't it a wonderful thing how what a miraculous thing how God made our bodies and how it all fits together. And I said, sure, it's miraculous, but I just wish you didn't have to use so many parts for me to memorize.
Right? Well, we could be amoebas.
Right.
I mean, at least we're not amoebas, right? That's so cool. Very interesting. You know, I had a listener just today in our Facebook group. The Learn True Health has a free Facebook group. You're welcome to join it. All the listeners are welcome to join it. And lots of great health questions asked there. And a woman asked a question about DHEA. She was not sure how much she should take. She's seeing a bioidentical hormone specialist who has her on DHEA, and she's concerned as to whether she's taking too little or too much. What are your thoughts on taking bioidentical hormones, especially one like DHEA?
Well, they certainly can have their place and they can be safely and appropriately used, but there's also times in which they can be overused. So it's pretty individualized and per levels. DHEA is one to where I probably end up using the least, and I am pretty conservative about dosing it. In most cases, it does come back to a good range again when the adrenals get healthier. So it's one that I see few really need to replace with it long term.
Great. And there's no concern of overdosing or underdosing if she's just following the instructions that were given?
There are concerns of overdosing, and we can see symptoms of like hair loss or facial hair growth or acne or palpitations or things along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, we got to be careful when messing with this kind of stuff. Dr. Ellen Christian, it's been such a pleasure having you on the show again. This has been so much fun. I highly recommend listeners checking out your book that's coming out very soon, The Metabolism Reset Diet. I'm very excited about that. And then going back and listening to episode 307, you share your story, which I just love your story. Your website is drchristianson.com. Is there anything you'd like to say to wrap up today's interview?
You know, the cool thing is that I'd love the listeners to stay active with your work and really hold on to, they started listening to you because they wanted some change in their life and some change in their health. And they had some glimmer of hope that it was possible and that lifestyle could help them bring them there. And I just want to take that glimmer, that ember, and pump the bellows and blow air on that and put some kindling around it. And it's completely true. You can radically just transform the quality of your life by doing the right things with your lifestyle. And yeah, keep on listening. You'll hear more good things from Ashley. She's guiding you in good ways. And don't give up on having that vision come true for you.
Beautiful. Yes, let's all create that vision together and then move towards it. Wonderful. Thank you so much. It has been such a pleasure. You are welcome back anytime you'd like to come teach.
Awesome. I would love to. We could do another round on go deep on the hormones or something. That'd be fun.
Well, you are welcome back anytime.
All right. Thanks so much, Ashley. Great to spend time with you.
Thanks so much. You too.
Are you looking to optimize your health? Are you looking to get the best supplements at the lowest price? For high quality supplements and to talk to someone about what supplements are best for you, go to takeyoursupplements.com and one of our fantastic True Health coaches will help you pick out the right supplements for you that are the highest quality and the best price. That's takeyoursupplements.com. Takeyoursupplements.com. That's takeyoursupplements.com. Be sure to ask about free shipping and our awesome referral program.